Decades ago, back in my time, kids depended on toys to have fun. Some of them had video games, but they weren't as fun as the ones we have today. It seems like playing with traditional toys was way more fun, but I do get it. Times change, technology changes, and people are now more advanced than ever. In today's video, we'll be looking at toys from the 80s that no kid wants to play with. Our first old toy is Jarts. Back in the wild, lawless 80s, some people at some toy company thought it'd be a good idea to make metal arrows with pointy tips for kids to play with. And I'm sure a lot of kids love the idea, but it seems like many people didn't think of the consequences of putting these toys on the market. It was chaos. Thousands of injuries were reported, and one person even died as a consequence of playing with Jarts. That's why the Consumer Product Safety Commission of the US had to ban the toy in 1988, and many of you never got to play with it. I know I didn't. Our next entry is Clackers. Kids didn't used to be so demanding. You can entertain them with pretty much anything, and the Clackers are proof of that. It was just a ring with a rope and two balls attached to it to make a clacking sound when they crashed against each other. If you're like me, your first actual exposure to these was from the old show Drake and Josh when they showed them off. Nothing wrong with it, am I right? The problem with those balls sometimes would break apart and send tons of tiny pieces flying around, which made the authorities ban the toy in the mid-80s. However, even if it hadn't been banned, I still don't think there would be many kids playing with Clackers today. With so many video games and electronics, the Clackers really do look old and boring. Our next toy is the Pogo Ball. Next we have the Pogo Ball. Not ball with two L's, but ball with one. The toy was a simple ball with a flying saucer-shaped disc around it. Kids would go on them and try to keep their balance, and it was sort of an earlier version of a hoverboard. Just didn't really move, actually. Okay, maybe not really, but the point is that kids had to keep their balance while standing on it. It does seem pretty harmless, but a lot of parents freaked out and finally got authorities to ban the toy because it was simply too dangerous. Our next toy is the Roller Racer. This toy looks like a small bicycle, and that's exactly why it posed a threat to any rider who dared to take the roller racer to the streets. The roller racer was so small that some drivers were not able to see the kids who were riding these miniature bicycles. For that reason alone, the roller racer got banned. It'd be pretty uncomfortable to drive a car next to someone riding a miniature vehicle such as this one in the first place. Our next entry is the Message Bears. Message Bears were a nice gesture that you could share with any person that was close to you. These bears had encouraging and sometimes straightforward messages that expressed how you felt about someone. You could find phrases such as, "I miss you, get well soon," and "I love you." It was like giving a card to someone, but better because you were giving them a bear. The problem with these bears, though, is that they came with a balloon attached to a stick, and some kids poked their eyes and choked with this artifact, so the best solution was to keep these bears and their balloons away from shelves. You know, sometimes it's much less the whole "this toy is dangerous" and more "a child is very, very stupid." Our next entry is Buckyballs. Not all toys are for kids. I mean, yeah, they'll play with anything you put in front of them. But some toys are meant to be kept at the office, kind of like Buckyballs that a lot of adults had on their desks to stimulate their imagination, or just to show them off as if they were some sort of decoration. The problem was that if swallowed, Buckyballs could be lethal. And if people were lucky to survive, they still had to go through uncomfortable surgeries to get these magnetic toys removed from their bodies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Of course, people were not supposed to swallow these, but there are always people, mostly children, who defy the rules and common sense and end up getting into deadly situations. For that reason, Buckyballs are no longer popular, or even available. However, you can get Specs, which are the sequel to Buckyballs. They're less dangerous, and it's said that they can help you concentrate. Our next terrifying toy is the Garbage Pail Kids. Not all the toys on this list were banned because they were dangerous. Some of them were simply a bad influence, and made for terrible movies as well. Of course, you don't want little kids going around learning bad habits because of their toys, but that's exactly what the Garbage Pail Kids were doing. These stickers were distracting kids from paying attention during class, and that's why adults had to ban them. Of course, because they're also the fun police, but hey. The thing is that kids would buy and trade their stickers and cards, and we all know that trading is not an easy process. You need to negotiate and make sure you get a good deal for what you have. Imagine doing that during class hours. I can see how that could be distracting, but these stickers were harmless compared to many other toys I'm mentioning today. Just gross, really. The next entry is Moon Shoes. Moon shoes were like having little trampolines attached to your feet, making you feel as if you were literally walking on the moon. But safety was not the main concern of the people who came up with this idea. The version that came out in the early 80s was made out of plastic, which resulted in a lot of people getting ankle injuries. That doesn't compare to all the accidents that happened with the early version that was made out of metal in the 50s. In the 90s, however, Nickelodeon brought the moon shoes back with lots of improvements to make sure that no one ever got hurt. Don't know if they're still around, but it was pretty neat. Our next toy is the Koosh Ball. Playing catch is one of the oldest games in history, and I'm sure most of you played it before you got into video games. The cool thing about playing catch is that the game doesn't present any major risks to any player involved. Of course, somewhere out there, a parent came up with an idea to make the game even safer, and that's how he invented the Koosh Ball. This ball is made out of thousands of rubber filaments, and honestly, I really don't actually see how anyone could get hurt by it. However, of course, they had some legal issues that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to rule in 1993, and a woman sued the company in 2003 after being hit by a Koosh Ball during the Rosie O'Donnell show. Despite it being so safe, it seems like the Koosh Ball ended up being quite problematic. Our next toy is the Speak and Spell. There are tons of apps that can help little children grasp their native language a bit sooner than expected, but before we had apps, there were toys that would do this work for us. One of them was Speak and Spell, a toy that would teach proper English to kids, and it was one of the first toys that instructed kids on how to properly pronounce and spell words. Today, there are many programs online that can teach us how to properly pronounce words, so I really don't see the need for this toy anymore. But it is worth remembering how this technology got started. Our next entry is Monster in My Pocket. Kids in the 80s had an obsession with monsters, and it looked nothing like the way kids are obsessed these days with Pokemon. Back then, Matchbox released a line of miniature toys with the shapes of known monsters from mythology, film, literature, and, of course, religion, which is the one branch that made things a little bit controversial. Kids would collect witches, fairies, cryptids, and many other figures that looked pretty scary. They even had one for the great beast that is mentioned in the Bible. It sounds really cool until you realize they also had one for Indian divinity, which was offensive to high officials from the Hindu religion. They didn't like the idea of seeing their divinity represented as a little plastic monster that was collectible. Today, kids aren't exactly interested in collecting plastic monsters if they are virtual, and many people try to stay away from plastic anyway, so that explains why we don't see these toys anymore. Our next entry is the Slip and Slide. Slip and slides were so popular between the 60s and the 90s that there were more than 9 million units sold between those years. But finally, people had to put a stop to those sales in the early 90s when a lot of adults were experiencing accidents while using these toys that were originally designed for kids. People still do use slip and slides these days, especially during the summer. However, it's of course recommended that only children use them to avoid back problems and other injuries in adults. Our next entry is Metal Playgrounds. You might know plastic playgrounds, but you might not know metal playgrounds. Believe it or not, they did exist, and kids from the 80s and 90s were pretty familiar with them. You could find them pretty much anywhere that had a space for kids. Wooden and plastic structures weren't as popular back then, and metal was the preferred material, but if you ask kids from the 80s, they'll probably tell you a bad experience that they had while playing in these spaces, especially the ones who loved the metal slides. These things would heat up to dangerous levels that made it quite annoying and even dangerous for kids to ride on. For that reason, most metal playgrounds were demolished, and many playgrounds today are way smaller compared to what the kids had back then. Now it's time for the day's best pick. Well, the picture I chose for the day shows a doll, a toy that many kids should be familiar with. However, not many kids actually play with them anymore. There was a doll that became quite problematic in the 80s as well, and let's check it out with Snack Time Cabbage Patch Doll. The Cabbage Patch Kids were a must-have among many children who grew up in the 80s. In fact, it's said that people went crazy on Black Friday in 1983 just to get their hands on these special dolls. The dolls could be customized to have different colors of eyes, hair, skin, as well as smiles, dimples, freckles, and different outfits. This could make them actually pretty unique from each other. But there was one called the Snack Time Cabbage Patch Kid that had a mechanical mouth that could easily grab children's hair. For that reason, Mattel had to pull it out of the market. Today, you can still buy Cabbage Patch dolls, not the one that eats your hair though, that one's gone for good. But there are many people buying dolls anyway, and I'm sure no one's going to be fighting over these during Black Friday. You're more likely to find people fighting in the electronics section and running over your grandmother. Before we move on, do me a favor. My analytics show that only about 15% of you watching are actually subscribed. Come on guys, what's up with that? Can you guys please hit the subscribe button? You guys watch my videos every day anyway, so you might as well subscribe and keep up to date with every video we put out. Our last entry is one that hits a little hard for me, ATARI. ATARI was one of the first video game consoles invented by the same people who created Pong. The Atari came with 2 joysticks, paddles, controllers, and game cartridges, including Asteroids, Space Invaders, and the famous Pac-Man. I think a lot of you nowadays will get bored after playing these for a few minutes, especially with the games we have nowadays. And of course with the games that we have today, Atari is buried in the past, but we should never forget that this console marked the beginning of the video games that we know of today. Did you ever get a chance to play with any of these old toys? How was it? Let us know in the comment section down below. With all that said and done, that's our video for today, folks, and I will see you all next time. Later, everybody.